We are back. It's the Joe Holka Show presented by Line Movement. Joining us, as always, to talk through some wide receiver sleepers. He's the reception perception creator. You know him from Yahoo Sports. It's Matt Harmon. Harmon, how's it going, my man? It's been a fun ride this season. I know there's no more season-long DFS, but it shouldn't be, at least. It's week 17. But how was your year overall? I'll ask you about that first. I normally ask you about how last week was, but I'm curious how your fantasy season was, man.
This season was great. You typically know if your predictions were good or not. Actual teams are good at, in terms of season-long fantasy. Obviously, daily fantasy is another discussion entirely. But, this year, a lot of my fantasy teams were in contention for most of the year. Obviously, didn't take home all of the championships or whatever. But, that's usually when okay, I'm having a good year because I got to care about all of these teams, which can be stressful. I got to care about all of these teams well into the double-digit weeks or whatever. So it was a good year. And I don't know about you, Joe, but I know for me personally that I care so much more about being right and being accurate in terms of the players that I'm excited about, obviously with the wide receiver position especially. I care about that a lot more than I care about my own teams or fantasy success or whatever. So to end the year with my guy Devante Adams going off on Sunday Night Football, I've had him as a top wide receiver in the NFL for the last 2 years. For him to drop a hammer on Sunday Night Football, and then for our guy Stefon Diggs to drop the hammer on Monday Night Football, two players I've hyped up. Reception perception is hyped up relentlessly for the better part of the last 3 years, and even more than that with Stefon Diggs. That was a great way to end the fantasy regular season. So that was definitely a nice little cherry on top of what's been a good year. First
off, I appreciate you saying Stefon Diggs is our guy now, so that's great. I think
we get to share that at this point. Your portfolio definitely gets to say that we shared that one. That's for sure.
Let's just say that you were much, 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 much earlier than I was on being super bullish on Stefon Diggs, man. So I appreciate you when it comes to that. So this is going to be a little bit of a different week 17. Obviously, there's a lot of implications in terms of which teams are motivated, which teams are not motivated. If you want more of a breakdown team by team, I did throw up a video on the Line Movement YouTube channel earlier this week going through those exact things for each team, which is very useful, especially if you're playing DFS. Some of these teams aren't very incentivized in general. So this week on this segment, I wanted to do it slightly different. I'm going to give Harmon a chance. Normally we go 5K and below, but it just made sense to talk about Curtis Samuel this week. He's 5,300 on DraftKings, but I think he's going to be extremely chalky. And again, I know Stefon Diggs is your guy, Harmon, but Curtis Samuel, definitely one of your guys for sure, right?
Yeah, he's in the clubhouse, right? Like the Allen Robinson, John Brown, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf clubhouse, Terry McLaurin, all those guys. Curtis Samuel definitely gets an invite.
Nice flex, bro. Are you kidding me with that lineup?
Listen, I didn't quite. I'm sure there's some duds that I could throw in there, but that was let's not talk about Marquise Brown. We're not sure if his ticket's going to get renewed this next season or not. But nevertheless, so Curtis Samuel last year, and I think this was interesting to talk about this past year because essentially this past week when he played Washington, he's going against the coaching staff that was in Carolina literally last year. Ron Rivera, obviously, but Scott Turner, the offensive coordinator, there's a lot of connective tissue between the 2019 Panthers and the 2020 Washington football team. And I'm not saying that Curtis Samuel is pissed at that coaching staff or anything like that, but it was interesting to see him have his best game as a full field player, as obviously getting a lot of rushing work too, because this coaching staff that was there in Carolina last year just so misused this guy to the point that, obviously I was excited about him last year in fantasy, really hyped him as one of the breakout players, didn't have a very good season. And it's because that coaching staff just had him run go routes. In terms of guys I charted for reception perception, only him and DK Metcalf were up above 25% of their routes being go routes. And obviously DK is a great vertical threat playing with one of the best vertical passers in the NFL. And I think Curtis Samuel can be a vertical threat too. He was winning a lot of deep passes last week, but just running straight go routes when your quarterback is Kyle Allen, not Cam Newton like you thought coming into the year, that's some pretty bad adjustments. So I think we love the role that Samuel's playing in right now. And since week 10, he's got more got more volume than Robbie Anderson not raw volume, but he's got more receiving yards. The role has been there for Samuel. He's been getting rushing attempts regardless of who's in the backfield. He's been getting targets as sort of that layup slot receiver. So I think this is a do-it-all player hitting his stride right now. as the season ends. And I definitely think that there's still plenty of incentive for Carolina. We saw them last week, despite their fan base, kind of wanting them to not throw the game, but would have been perfectly fine for them to lose that game. Matt Rule came out and said, that's not how we play. We're still going to go full throttle. So regardless of what New Orleans is doing on the other side of the field, I expect Samuel and all of these receivers to still be playing really well. And this is a guy playing for a contract too. His deal is up at the end of the year, so he certainly wants to end 2020 on a high note.
I'm with you, man. I love the Samuel call this week. He does have more targets over the last 4 than Robbie Anderson. The air yards are pretty similar, but I think the price makes a lot of sense at 5,300. So it's one of those ones that, New Orleans, regardless of what's happening over there, Samuel's the one on this team that stood out of just being completely mispriced. So I'm with you on that. This next guy is one that you're probably gonna have to talk me into a little bit. We've been talking up your boy Tim Patrick a little bit, but what in the world has been going on with Jerry Judy, man? Everyone wants to know. He's 4,200 this week on DraftKings. This is a week where sometimes you see some of these rookies get a little bit more volume kind of going into the offseason.
Right. So we've definitely talked up Tim Patrick for sure. And I think this Denver group is really interesting to talk about for next year because, let's not forget, we've been talking about Tim Patrick. I think we've said this on the show that he's kind of the discount version of Cortland Sutton. Well, right. The actual version of Cortland Sutton is coming back next year. I think Patrick has played too well to be totally removed from the equation. KJ Hamler, another rookie this year, he's flashed vertical skills. Deshaun Hamilton's not the worst, 4th or 5th receiver in the NFL. He can pop up and make plays. They still have Fant at tight end. That's a crowded group. And then Jerry Judy, obviously among this as well. This has been a tough stretch for Judy. I know that I've come on this show plenty of times and talked to you about how drops don't really move the needle for me because they're a noisy statistic. They don't carry over year. I think you can look, actually, a perfect example of kind of a positive for Jerry Judy right now is Calvin Ridley's a player who dropped a ton of passes his rookie season. He was missing plays. He wasn't winning contested passes. And I actually had questions about both of these guys and Amari Cooper too. It's just weird. These Alabama receivers have actually all kind of followed a similar path where I had questions about them in college, Judy, Ridley, and Amari Cooper, about how consistent they would be catching the ball, not with drops, but in tight physical situations. Obviously, Cooper, it took a little while longer than it has with Ridley, but we know he's one of the best receivers in the NFL. Ridley has been super productive this year, one of the most productive receivers in the NFL, and I think has graduated from being, a strong number 2 to potentially being the alpha there in Atlanta. That's the way he's played. And I think when you look at Jerry Judy, very similar player. He separates all over the field, gets open really well, but his problem hasn't just been 5 straight up drops last week. It's been the same issues that I had with him in college, and Ridley to an extent is he's a guy that doesn't win 50-50 balls. He struggles in traffic. Now, that's a more concerning note with Judy than any just drops concerns or whatever. So I want to put that cautionary tale out there. Nevertheless, the guy has been getting the volume, ton of volume last week. He's not catching 50% of the targets thrown his way. Some of that's drops, some of that's the quarterback play. However, Joe, come on. The Raiders defense on the other side of the field, if he just squeezes a few more of these targets coming his way, he can make big plays against this Raiders defense that is A, undisciplined, and B, just poorly manned from a personnel standpoint. So it's rough after the showing that he gave us last week. However, I don't mind going back at Judy at a very low cost, across the industry, very low cost. And I just, again, think some of that volume can turn into production based on the individual talent of this player. I know Denver media, Broncos fans are kind of being hard on him right now, but wouldn't surprise me if by 2022 we're never talking about drops with Judy because he's making the plays that he needs to make, similar with Cooper and Ridley at this point in their careers.
Yeah, so Jerry Judy, like you said, he's been getting the volume on paper. He is leading this team in air yards over the last 3 weeks. I know that some air yards are more valuable than others. The Jets have taught us that this year, but I think that you just look at this, 13 targets, only 4 catches for Jerry Judy over that span. But one thing that's kind of interesting, you just look at these air yards, there's some similar volume here in terms of target share, but like Jerry Judy has just left so much on the field that at some
Yep.
point that's going to regress back to the mean. So I think this is a decent week to go back to him. Definitely a talent, maybe a confidence issue, maybe it's a quarterback issue. I think that he's someone that will turn it around eventually. So
one more note on that too, because I think this always comes into play when we're talking about air yards and quarterback connection and things like that. And you're right. I mean, even since week 10, I remember coming on the show and talking about being really excited about Jerry Judy finally moving into that outside receiver role that I think he should have held all along, not being a slot guy specifically for the Broncos. I mean, since week 10, he has 45 targets. Tim Patrick is second on the team at 33. Like, they have tried to treat him as a number one. I just think it's always important to remember, like, the relationship between a quarterback and a wide receiver matters here. And I would say probably one of the worst timing anticipatory players in the NFL quarterback is probably Drew Locke. And I think a player like Judy, he's not a Julio Jones, Michael Thomas, Devante Adams. Like, I can win no matter who's out there because I'm that good. I do think Judy's more of a timing anticipatory route runner, and maybe if the Broncos make a quarterback change, that might help bring some of those air yards into the actual stat sheet, even more so than just him dropping passes or missing plays in tight coverage.
It's really good context there. I think that in terms of like quarterback issues, one guy that's at least been able to kind of battle through it a little bit most recently is the next guy on your list, T. Higgins. So he's a top 20 wide receiver over the last 3 weeks in terms of his weighted opportunity. Obviously, there's some injuries in I guess that team overall, Tyler Boyd in particular. So T. Higgins at 5K this week, another team that doesn't have much to play for, but this rookie, he's flashed at times. So if we still just, I guess, don't have a lot to love at quarterback there, are you still interested in T. Higgins this week?
Yeah, because he's been productive regardless of who's out there. You know, Brandon Allen, Ryan Finley, whatever. That connection has stayed there. And I think, too, there's not much for the Bengals to play for, but there's a ton for the Ravens to play for in this game. So I think this will be a competitive back and forth game. Obviously, I expect the Ravens to win. I expect them to really handle their business against the Bengals, and I expect them to go into the playoffs and potentially be one of the more dangerous teams in the playoffs because of how well they're playing right now. But there has been some issues on that defense just in terms of injuries. They're not quite playing. I think they're a defense in Baltimore that could get hot and just crush through the playoffs. But there have been some injuries in terms of the secondary. There has been some issues in the pass rush. Like, this is a group that I think that you don't completely shy away from just based on matchups. And I think that Higgins is looking like the best receiver right now in Cincinnati. I mean, clearly more so than AJ Green. Even when Tyler Boyd is out there, I think Higgins brings more value. He's a guy that has kind of exceeded my expectations as a rookie. He's like a classic old school possession receiver that quarterbacks are comfortable throwing to those guys, even when they're in tight coverage. I think that's going to be a good note for Higgins to end the season on. Again, he's been a surprising player, not just because he's been productive over the course of the year, but especially here at the end of the year without Joe Burrow.
Yeah, like you said, the Ravens have to win in order to get in the playoffs. I think there's a small chance, but like a very small chance if they lose that they could get in that final wild card spot. So they're going to be playing hard. One thing that I guess you can't take away from the Bengals, like they've still been playing hard as well. So like we've seen them play really well against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So like I don't think they're going to go out there and just lay an egg. I would imagine that T. Higgins, even at 5K, is going to gain a little bit of steam in DFS throughout this week. But Harmon, we did it, man. That's 17 weeks in the book. We'll see if we can get these things going a little bit more during playoffs, or a little bit, I guess, continue it. I don't know what your schedule's like. We'll talk about that off of stream. But if not, man, it's been a pleasure doing this with you all season long. And hopefully there was some people that benefited from getting a little bit deeper into the wide receiver position, my man. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, hell yeah. Thank you so much, Joe, for having me on. This has been a really fun regular season. If you're down to do playoffs, like, hit me up. I'm always willing to talk wide receivers, man, especially when we got some of the best ones in the league going into the postseason. So I hope your listeners benefited. If it wasn't, in daily fantasy, every single week hits or whatever, I hope you learned something about wide receivers along the way. And obviously, if your listeners are curious, just hit up the hashtag reception perception. We're going to be going hard in the off season with a ton of really cool content and covering a ton of these players that we talked about this year, and potentially some rookies next year. So it'll be a fun ride, and I appreciate you having me along for it.
Always tough to figure out who's this going to be the wide receiver sleeper on a Wednesday when a lot of the ownership stuff hasn't come through. So I know that's not always the easiest. Obviously, reception perception, I guess a little bit of a tease. I'm getting a little bit more into the sports card investing type of thing. So I actually showed Harmon one of the ones that I bought recently, but I'll save that as a little bit of a tease for now. I'm definitely going to hit you up in the offseason, Harmon, because I want to get in early on some of these wide receivers and some guys that you think have a chance to make large steps. So everyone follow Matt on Twitter. Yeah, I mean, so far you have, man. I'm going to keep, I guess, riding your coattails on that sort of thing. So follow him on Twitter at Matt Harmon _BYB, and we'll talk to everyone soon.